for Richard Nixon, not because they disliked Kennedy, but they didn't trust him. They saw Nixon as reliably anti-communist. Those results were presented, and those results meant nothing because the decision at the top of Philadelphia by the ruling Democratic Party was that Kennedy was going to win. And they turned in results saying that 90+% of all voters in Philadelphia voted for John F. Kennedy. So the election was a fraud in 1960. And I can tell you, having lived in that city for many years afterwards, they haven't had a clean election in that place for 50, 60 years. Now, what makes you think that's going to change between now and the fall of 2024?
Interesting. So I don't think Joe Biden is fit for office even now. So how will he be fit for office in fall 2024 or 2025?
Well, that's interesting you bring that up because I didn't think he was fit for office when he held the Senate seat. So, I'm one of those people that thought, this is appalling. But we've got lots of people that are installed in these positions for decades. They have donors, people that keep them there. And right now, Washington is donor-occupied territory. In other words, everyone used to talk about corporations. It's not just corporations now. We have oligarchs, and they produce vast quantities of cash, and they can influence elections. It's a huge, huge problem. So again, when you ask about elections, I'm not sure. I just don't know.
We will see. So your take is perhaps there won't be any elections in fall.
I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, if there are, I just don't know why anyone expects a better or a new outcome. That's the problem.
Yeah. So let's switch gears and talk about another war zone. Let's talk about Israel and Gaza. What's your take on this situation right now?
This is different from all of the previous wars that Israel has been involved in. The last major war was in 1973. And in October 1973, the Israelis were surprised by the swiftness and the effectiveness of the Egyptian attack across the Suez Canal, to the point where the Egyptians moved across the canal, set up a defense, and defeated the Israelis in their attempts to retake the ground in the Suez. In Syria, the Syrians broke through but were unable to organize themselves effectively, so the breakthroughs were stopped by a handful of very brave tank crews. And once the war in Syria turned in favor of the Israelis, they turned back to the Egyptian front. And then, of course, they managed to eventually penetrate, cross the canal. We intervened because we made it clear that we and the Soviets would not tolerate the destruction of the government in Cairo. And the rest is history. This is a very different set of circumstances. This time, the Israelis were surprised, and they were also horrified because they saw this very barbarous, savage attack. But even more important, they saw this attack emanate from a place called Gaza that was effectively under lock and key. Or it's a large open-air prison from the standpoint of most Arabs that lived there. And the Israelis, I was just over there in 2020, and I visited the southern front facing Gaza, and I saw how the Israelis were organized. And I was shocked because I thought the Israelis had a very clear grasp of what was happening every minute of every day on the ground in Gaza. Well, I guess I was wrong. And so the population was even more shocked at the failure of Israeli intelligence and military power to deal with this sudden and striking attack. I think those things embarrassed the Israelis, embarrassed their government, embarrassed their leadership, embarrassed the population because they see themselves as very superior to the peoples that surround them, as better educated, more capable, better equipped, better trained, better informed, and so forth. So I think what you then saw happen was a vengeance campaign. We've got to go in there and demonstrate conclusively, not just to the people living in Gaza, but to everyone in the region, that if you do something like this to us, we will annihilate you. And you've always had large numbers of Israelis who have aspired to create this greater Israel, which is everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. They are now in charge. And they say, that's it. The only way we will be safe is to rid ourselves permanently of this population. So while there's lots of talk about destroying Hamas and rescuing hostages, the ultimate goal, I think, is to remove the population that is there. Because from their standpoint, if you say, well, that's unacceptable, they'll say, wait a minute, you want us to go after a school of fish in an ocean. And that school of fish is Hamas, but they swim in an ocean surrounded by large quantities of fish. So the only thing we can do to be certain is to drain the ocean. They're draining the ocean in Gaza. Now, I think that's very dangerous because I, unlike my Israeli colleagues, think that the region has changed dramatically. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these are not the same countries they were 50 years ago. They actually have populations that can read, write, think, understand, follow social media, and are capable of employing not just conventional weapons, but other things. They can manipulate internets, they can hack computers, and all these sorts of things. And then behind them stand two regional superpowers. One is Turkey, and the other is Iran. Now, the interesting thing is that Iran historically is not violently Israeli. I know people look at me and they think, well, that's strange. The Iranian government says X, Y, and Z, but the population there has never been overtly anti-Israeli. Frankly, lots of Iranians have about as much interest in what's happening there as the people in Kansas City do in what's happening in eastern Ukraine. But Iran wants to be a leader inside the Islamic world. It wants to assert itself, so it can't walk away from it. And of course, it has Hezbollah. And the original intention behind Hezbollah was to build this up so that the people in southern Lebanon, the Shiites that lived there, would have nothing to fear from Israel. Well, Hezbollah is far beyond that stage. They can field thousands and tens of thousands of very competent fighters. They fought in the Syrian war, and they have precision-guided missiles and rockets. I mean, they can level a large part of Israel. So can Iran. Iran does not have an army capable of threatening Israel or a navy, but it has an enormous arsenal of precision weapons, rockets, unmanned systems, missiles. That could devastate Israel, all conventional. And they made the decision to go to the conventional warheads and build up this arsenal rather than beat themselves to death in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, contrary to popular belief. And then there is Turkey. The Turks are the most martial people in the region. Turks are ferocious soldiers. I've seen them. I've worked with them. They're competent. They're not stupid. And they can field an army of 2 million in the space of a month. They have a very effective reserve mobilization system. They have the largest fleet of unmanned systems, flying unmanned systems, aerial unmanned systems in the world. Some of them are new, some of them are not, but they can all do a lot of damage. They have a very formidable navy. And Mr. Erdogan aspires to be the de facto leader of the Muslim world. And he speaks in those terms, and his recent speeches were not just directed at Turkey, they were directed at the whole Islamic world, as well as to us, where he has said very categorically, we are no longer talking with Mr. Netanyahu. He is the leader of a crime state, a war criminal himself, and Israel is a war crime state. And at some point, and he's made this very clear, Turkish soldiers will fight in Gaza. Then he's gone a step further and he said, listen, Mr. Netanyahu, your nuclear weapons won't save you. Now, people say, well, how is that possible? And what people in the West are beginning to understand is that Turkey has always had access to nuclear warheads, if needed, from Pakistan. And in fact, members of Pakistan's parliament have stood up and said, it's time for us to help our brothers in Turkey, to provide them with the nuclear deterrent they need. And that ultimately is the key word. It's not as much about using a nuclear weapon as it is having one that deters your opponent, in this case, Israel, from using one. It's very dangerous. This is well beyond anything we've ever seen before in the region. And for the first time in probably 1,000 years, all of those Muslims are unified in their opposition to what's happening in Gaza. So my position is Israel's got to back off. and it has to find another way forward, because if it doesn't, it's on the path to a regional war that I do not think the Israelis can win. And of course, they're betting very heavily on us that we will somehow or another make up the deficit, compensate for whatever it is they don't have. Well, there are two problems with this. First of all, we're not living in 1991. The vast forces that we had at our disposal then don't exist now. We don't have an army to send. What we call an army is strewn out in small pieces across Eastern Europe. And I'll be frank with you, it's a shadow of what I served in. It's not very capable. And then you're talking about the Navy. Well, yes, we have several carrier battle groups, and they can do many things, but their ability to influence things ashore is limited. And then, of course, is the Air Force, which needs land-based facilities from which to fly. Now, perhaps the expectation is that the Italians, the Greeks, the Bulgars, and others will have no objections if we want to fly strikes in support of Israel. I'm not so sure. And then finally, there is the American electorate. My generation is very sensitive to the Holocaust. We saw that in the aftermath of the war. We all lived through that. The generation that is now moving into positions of influence and power and authority in the United States does not share that view. In fact, their view is something that happened 80 years ago does not give anyone the right to brutalize, punish, or mistreat collectively a group of people today. So it's a different set of circumstances. And for those reasons, I've tried to tell my Israeli colleagues who will listen, it's time to reconsider this course of action, because it may not lead to what you want. And I warn them about us. They think that we're steadfast, but I've told you already, how do we ultimately behave when things don't go our way?
Is there a big influence or like something like an Israel lobby in Washington, D.C.? Or why are there carriers in front of Israel and supporting the Netanyahu strategy?
Yeah, I would say that the people on the Hill are very, very responsive to donors. And enormous quantities of money have been spent over many, many years securing the loyalty of elected representatives in both the House and the Senate. As I said before, my generation, you didn't need to be on the receiving end of cash to be supportive. Today, I think it's necessary. I don't think the Israelis can take for granted that they're going to get all the support that they want. I think there are actual limits now. I don't know. I could be wrong. Perhaps I've misjudged it, and the Americans will merrily march off to war in support of Israel against the entire Muslim world. I don't think so. The other thing is, remember, we're very vulnerable, you, Europeans, Americans, to economic implications. What do you do if the Straits of Hormuz are shut? What do you do if you lose access to the Suez Canal? Vessels are already being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope in the south to move in through the Mediterranean to reach Israel because they're worried that something could happen in the Suez. That's the tip of the iceberg. There are all sorts of other things that can happen. And then, of course, in the background stand Russia and China. And the Russians and the Chinese, in my judgment, will not stand idly by and allow Iran to be destroyed by us. And I think there are limits to what they're prepared to do, but I doubt seriously that they would allow Turkey to be destroyed either. Especially Russia would be acutely sensitive to that. So we don't know what they will do, but I think we can bet on some form of support that could come to the aid of people in the region against Israel. So peace is actually an appealing alternative if we could get somebody to buy into it. And you're not going to get a perfect outcome. You're not going to be able to satisfy everybody, but you've got to try to do something, because the alternative looks like Armageddon.
Yeah, definitely. If this spreads, it will be horrible. It will be World War III, actually. But I can't still